Today, we're taking a closer look at the regulatory landscape in Singapore, specifically focusing on PayPal. We'll be examining the potential tension between its own contractual enforcement practices and its legal obligations under the Payment Services Act of 2019.
Here's how we'll break it down. First, we'll establish Singapore's regulatory framework. Then, we'll define what the duty to safeguard funds actually means. After that, we'll look at how internal enforcement works in practice, explore a potential regulatory conflict, and finally, discuss oversight and some key open questions.
All right, so to really get to the bottom of this, we first need to understand the official rules of the road, the regulatory environment that PayPal operates in within Singapore. Now, the first thing to know is that PayPal isn't just any company operating in the region. Its Singaporean entity, PayPal PT Limited, is officially licensed as a major payment institution. This means it's directly supervised by the Monetary Authority of Singapore, also known as MAS. And that brings us to the key piece of legislation for our analysis, the Payment Services Act of 2019. This act is absolutely foundational because it lays out these specific, strict rules for how institutions like PayPal are required to handle and protect their customers' money.
So let's move on and dig a little deeper. In Section 2, we're going to define exactly which funds get protected under this law and what that protection really entails.
You know, the law has a very specific term for customer funds, relevant money. This legal distinction is so important because it draws a clear line in the sand. It formally separates the money that belongs to users from the company's own funds that it uses for day-to-day operations. Think of it like a legal wall between these two pools of money. Relevant money has to be kept in separate, segregated trust accounts. It can't be mixed with the company's operational cash. This is designed to protect it in case the company has financial trouble. So, what this all boils down to is that under this framework, PayPal's legal role is that of a custodian of client funds. It's holding the money on behalf of its users, but it is not the actual owner of that money.
Okay, so with that legal duty to protect funds in mind, let's pivot to Section 3. Here, we'll look at a very specific tool PayPal uses in its contracts and see how it's actually applied. Right inside PayPal's acceptable use policy, there's a clause for what's called liquidated damages. It specifies a charge of $2,500 for each violation. Operationally, you might also see this labeled as a loss recovery. And here's the critical part. The way this clause is enforced isn't subject to any outside review. There's no court order, no independent arbitration, and no prior judicial sign-off. This is an internal enforcement decision executed directly against the account balance. Now, this is where it gets interesting. You might think this is just a single charge, but that's not always how it's applied. In many cases, the enforcement action results in what can only be described as a full balance sweep, which is where the entire available balance in an account is taken, down to zero. And this is a really key distinction. The contract talks about a set amount per violation, which you'd think would mean you'd see an itemized list of charges. But in practice, the result is often not a single predefined penalty, but the complete absorption of the available balance, often without a clear, transparent calculation shown to the user. So this brings us to the very heart of our regulatory analysis in Section 4, this apparent conflict between the legal duty to safeguard funds and the practice of unilateral enforcement. So on one side, you have the Payment Services Act, which requires the segregation, custody, and protection of client money. On the other side, you have an internal policy that leads to penalties and balance sweeps. The central question becomes, if safeguarded funds are held in trust, can they then be fully absorbed through a unilateral internal process? This is what creates that potential regulatory tension we're talking about. The company's role as a fiduciary custodian obligated to protect money seems to be at odds with its actions when it unilaterally seizes that very same money for its own benefit. And what makes this question even more pointed is that in many instances, there are no external claims to justify the seizure. No chargebacks from buyers, no claims from third parties, and no court-validated damages. The loss being recovered is based entirely on an internal decision that a policy was violated. So who oversees all of this? And what are the specific questions that need to be asked? That's what we'll get into in our final section. Ultimately, the responsibility for looking into this tension falls to the regulator. The Monetary Authority of Singapore has the direct authority to assess whether a licensed institution is complying with all the conditions of the Payment Services Act.
In light of this framework, several technical clarification questions arise. And just to be clear, these aren't accusations. They are precise, regulatory inquiries aimed at understanding how these practices align with the law. The first question is, at what precise moment does a client balance cease to qualify as relevant money under the PSA when PayPal executes one of these loss recovery charges? Second, under which specific provision of the PSA does PayPal interpret its authority to transfer funds from safeguarded trust accounts for its own benefit without any client instruction or a judicial order? Third, if the contract establishes a set amount per violation, how is the complete wipeout of an account balance justified without a transparent, itemized breakdown for each of those events? The fourth question, when there are no chargebacks or third-party claims, what is the precise nature of the loss that is being recovered with a full balance sweep? And finally, the fifth question, how does PayPal reconcile its fiduciary duty as a custodian under the PSA with the act of becoming the ultimate beneficiary of the entire safeguarded balance through its own unilateral enforcement? These are regulatory interpretation questions that may warrant supervisory clarification. And this leaves us with a final thought to consider. When internal enforcement mechanisms can empty safeguarded accounts without any judicial oversight, the interaction between that contractual enforcement and the statutory duty to safeguard becomes a legitimate regulatory question under the PSA 2019.